Hey, and welcome back. I'm Ben.
And this is Joe.
You're listening to the Shit Hit the Fan miniseries of the Actor podcast, in which we talk about digital safety and security with focus on activists.
This is a mini series of short 20-ish minute episodes of conversations between the two of us on various topics on activism in these chaotic times.
In today's episode, we're going to talk about regulation, in particular in the European Union with the GDPR and the Market Regulations Act, and what to think about big tech companies' claims on privacy. Enjoy.
So, when it comes to Europe, what role does the EU or the government play in this regulating these apps and regulating Google and stuff like that? So, how I understood, there's not much regulation in the US, but is there anything that based on your location is something is disabled, or how does that really work when it comes to Europe and regulation?
Yeah, so the European Union has passed already quite a few years ago GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, which essentially states that if I am using your service and you want to track anything of what I do, you need to have my permission to do that.
Mm.
You need to tell me what kind of tracking you're doing, what kind of tracking happens, what purposes tracking has, very important side note, and who else will get that access to that data. And again, for what purpose do they get access to that data? That is the entire GDPR guideline, which since then meant that a lot of more websites have these cookie banners come up, where when you access them the first time, they're like, hey, we'd like to track you. And they don't have to do that. Businesses pretend they have to do that. They could also simply not track you. That is totally legitimate thing to do. There is one very minor subset that is called functional tracking, where, for example, if you want to log into Facebook, they need to know which browser you're using, like who is that on the other end. So they have some mini thing called a cookie that they plug on your side, and so every request now they know, okay, Joe is asking, right? That is a functional tracking. That is totally legit. You can do that. You're not allowed to do marketing tracking. You're not allowed to do tracking how the person uses your application and that sort of thing unless they have agreed to that. And this is why you have these pop-ups. These pop-ups essentially want to make you agree to them tracking you. So I highly recommend that. I still do it every time, especially when these organizations try to make it more annoying to go through and disable it. The law is still being figured out in practice, because in essence it says it needs to be as simple to disable it as it is to enable it, which a lot of organizations do not actually do. And you're not allowed to track until they have agreed to that, which is also not necessarily what all organizations do. But that is a very important legislation that protects European customers. And that also applies to anybody doing business in Europe with European customers. So, for example, Facebook and Google. They're not allowed to do that either. Like when you probably don't remember that, but the very first time when you went to Google, and that still happens to me sometimes. We have a development phone, and so then it opens Google on the browser. You get a really big cookie pop-up saying like, "Hey, we want to track you," and you can say no. And even if you agree to that, especially on organizations that you don't really like Facebook and that kind of stuff, and it's of course very often hidden very deep in the setting somewhere, you can disable it again. And you should. You should definitely disable that. That is the one really big piece of legislation that changes that for us. Which also means that I need to, like if I'm tracking you, if I track any information about you, I need to explain to you what I'm tracking and for what purpose. Which also means that this entire data broker business that the US has doesn't really exist in a legal framework in Europe. Because I would need to know that beforehand for every organization that I sell it to later. So when you see like these, there's also some YouTube videos about that kind of stuff. That is mostly US-based information sharing. That only exists in the illegal side of business in Europe. And to my understanding, isn't really big. Because that's the other thing, as soon as I, for example, send you an email, and you're not sure why you get that email, you have the right to request that I prove to you that it was legitimate for me to write you that email. Meaning that if I got that email through a data leak or some other illegal means and then email you, and you email me back saying, okay, I want proof that I signed up for this newsletter and I want you to remove that immediately, and I do not respond, you can go to your local authorities and say, like, this organization does illegal data brokering. And that comes with hefty fines. There definitely is this framework, especially for privacy. The other thing to mention, and that is not as much about privacy as it is about market control, but in Europe, you get to choose your search engine and now also your app market, also on iPhone phones. On iPhones, until very recently, you had to use the Apple browser. Even if you installed Firefox, it was using the Apple browser internally with just some nice markup around it that looked like Firefox. But it wasn't Firefox. And the Market Regulation Act by the European Union basically means that you get the freedom to choose. You get the freedom to choose your browser, so you can install Firefox on an iPhone in Europe now. Interestingly, only in Europe. And you get to choose also an app store. On Android, you can already install other app stores than the Google Play Store. But on iOS, that wasn't possible until very recently. It is now possible. There's a few ones. None of them, of course, is as big, but it gives you the liberty to not use that Apple stuff.
Right. And how is it decided? How does the device know what location you're like? How is it, for example, if I'm now traveling to Brazil and I will download it there, but I'm based in Europe,
The specifics here aren't quite clear, but the legality applies to European. It's less about where you are than who you are, legally speaking. And so in that sense, if you set up your iPhone or your Android, Google and Apple get some information about you. You probably don't remember, but you signed in. You cannot actually use an iPhone without signing in with your Apple ID.
Yeah.
And that is linked to your credit card, that is linked to the original phone bill, that is like, they know who you are.
Yeah.
Which makes it really easy for governments to then say, well, you know exactly who we're talking about. And so they get to have that. So if you buy an iPhone in Europe, it is a different build than the one in the US. For quite a while, you couldn't even use a US phone in Europe because it used different frequencies to communicate to the channel. So there's actual difference in hardware that needs to be manufactured for certain regions.
Yeah.
And so there's some people who are importing phones from Europe to the US because it has these features. And as long as they don't sign up with their American credit card, they will continue having that features. And as soon as they don't, Apple switches back to the other mode.
Right. Okay, so we do have some protection if you are located in Europe. Talking about that, all those regulations, cookies, and I do feel like there are some big tech companies that kind of try to address the privacy concerns and claim that they're doing something. But is it really so, or is it just marketing? Is it just kind of faking it?
I take the economist approach on this. As I said earlier, it's really a question of whether that is good or bad for your bottom line.
Yeah.
You never know if that is serious until it's been continuously done when it's questioned. What I mean by that is corporate responsibility programs have been around for forever. A big corporation seems to be bad, so they come up with a marketing ploy of saying, oh, but this data center we build, all of that extra water goes into the next, I don't know, forest, and then it sustains the forest. These kind of claims, right? We've seen them all the time. We have seen one of them being rolled back over the last 2 years very actively, and that was on climate change. Climate change, 3, 4, 5 years ago was all the rage. All of the, like Google claimed it was like, it's going to be CO2 neutral by 2025, I think, which is this year. Data centers require a lot of energy and also a lot of water, which is not known to most people. They put a lot of chemicals in the water for cooling, and then you cannot really use the water anymore. There's a lot of fresh water being used by these data centers, but also obviously a lot of energy. And they had been on plan on that, but because of AI and AI requiring a lot of energy now, they have rolled back on that. They have very actively broken They have been in decline in CO2 usage for quite a while, and then last year it shot up like because that energy that they now want and require isn't quickly available through renewables. So that means that AI stuff keeps coal plants, power plants alive. That would otherwise been shut down because it's not attractive because you're not making enough money. Or very famously, we'll see how far that goes, but I think it's Microsoft who bought 3 Mile Island, who wants to get back 3 Mile Island, the US nuclear reactor that had an accident in the 70s. So they're restarting that, right? So all of the sustainability programs are out of the door. They don't care. They cared because it was the trend of the time that they had to care. So honestly, when it's about privacy, I don't believe them a word, even if they claimed them. And even though I have good friends and colleagues working at some of these organizations, usually not in the data departments, doing great work in open source software and that kind of stuff, these organizations as a whole do not give a crap at the end of the day if that means their bottom line is in question. That said, there's still some that act differently than others. And for some, it is at least for now an opportune point to make it a market differentiator to have privacy more in the focus.
Yeah.
It does not mean that they generally care or that they will hold on to that if it comes to it. But we have seen Apple in particular not helping law enforcement break iPhones. Primarily by saying, look, it's math, it's crypto, we can't. But also putting like privacy concern more into their forefront marketing. I am not sure if that is going to hold on to in a Trump administration. We'll see.
Yeah, that's another podcast episode. I guess we need to do part of this shit hit the fan series.
And that was it for today.
Short and sweet as usual. Don't miss our other episodes of this mini-series.
Subscribe to Digital Activism wherever you get your podcasts from.
By the way, we are thinking about changing the name of the podcast, so if you have any ideas or suggestions or any other comments, let us know, either by the Actor app or email us at podcast@actor.global.